Her name was Vipsania Julia Agrippina, but she was known simply as Julilla or Little Julia. Born in 19 BC, she was the second child of Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, the man forever beloved by Rome's legions, and Julia Augustifilia, the ever-controversial daughter of Caesar Augustus. She was the second grandchild of Augustus, born between her older brother Gaius and her younger brother Lucius. Then her parents gave her a sister, also named Vipsania Julia, to add to the 4 older half-sisters from her father's previous marriages. And finally, Little Julia had yet another brother, Marcus Vipsanius, named for her famous father, but called posthumous because he was born after their father, Marcus Agrippa's death. At the tender age of approximately 13, she had been given away in marriage to Lucius Aemilius Paulus, her first cousin on her mother Julia's side. Both she and her bridegroom were the grandchildren of Scribonia Libo, who had once been married to her grandfather, Caesar Augustus. The marriage of Julilla to Paulus was meant to bear political fruit. In that same year, when Julilla had been wedded to the son of Cornelius Scipio, her mother's sister, Julilla's 14-year-old brother Gaius had been unanimously elected to the consulship by the people of Rome. Her brother was now called Gaius Caesar. Her new Claudian stepfather, Tiberius, however, posed a threat to her grandfather's succession plans. But Julilla's mother Julia and grandmother Scribonia had hoped to stop him by discreetly managing her brother's election. Other families who were supporters of her mother and grandmother, like the Sempronii and the Aemilii, the family Julilla's husband came from, had agreed to support her older brother. But then, Julilla's grandfather, Caesar Augustus, had put his foot down. He didn't take back her brother's accomplishment, but he had postponed his consulship until he reached the age of 20. No matter. Julilla's mother still was very happy that the whole incident had caused her stepfather Tiberius to leave Rome altogether. And now her grandfather must help her brothers, and that was sure to please her mother. But things did not work out as planned. By 4 AD, both Julilla's brothers were dead, and her mother and grandmother were being punished on an island, while her stepfather had been brought back to Rome. Julilla's poor grandfather was now completely surrounded by Claudians, who supported her stepfather, Tiberius. The people of Rome had noticed, and they didn't like it. The plebs had protested the harsh punishments given to Julilla's mother and grandmother. For several years they had marched in the streets, shouting at her grandfather to release the merry widow. But when her stepfather, Tiberius, had been formally adopted into the Julian family following the mysterious deaths of her brothers, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, the plebs had begun to ask questions. Pointing their fingers at the Claudians, the Roman people became even more angry, and they wanted answers. Julilla's grandfather sought to appease the public by moving Scribonia and Julia from the isolated island of Pandataria to the town of Rhegium, back on the mainland. He purchased a domus in which they could live and extended to them a generous monthly allowance. Though Julilla's mother and grandmother were now permitted to move about the town, they were forbidden to return to Rome, nor were they allowed to shed the watchful eye of their guards. Caesar Augustus further attempted to subdue the anger of the people by finally adopting Julilla's last brother, posthumous Agrippa. But the people's outrage was anything but subdued. Gaius and Lucius's adoption had come with promises of career advancement. They had been given offices, priesthoods, and titles, all in advance of the legal age requirements set forth by Roman law. But for posthumous Agrippa, nothing. No preferential treatment was offered. And so, the plebs intensified their efforts. In 6 AD, the demonstrations on behalf of Julilla's family took on a more sophisticated tone. At night, as the citizens of Rome slept, bulletins and pamphlets began to appear on buildings around the Forum Romanum. These pamphlets, attributed to a Publius Rufus, generated much sympathy for the fallen scions of Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, alleging blood on the hands of the Claudians. The groundswell also criticized the methods of Caesar Augustus in adopting Posthumus, legally changing his name from Vipsanius Agrippa to Marcus Julius Caesar, all but guaranteeing that the name of Julila's father would soon vanish from Rome's memory. Also within the handbills were demands that Caesar Augustus release the large inheritance bequeathed to Posthumus by their late father, Marcus Agrippa, over which Augustus had assumed control. The pamphlets accused Julila's grandfather of theft by adoption as a means of depriving Julila's brother of his rightful inheritance. Julila's outraged grandfather, Caesar Augustus, launched an investigation. A man by the name of Publius Plautius Rufus was apprehended and charged with authorship of the pamphleting campaign of 6 AD. Upon standing trial before Rome's Senate, however, it was proven that his name had been used seditiously and without his knowledge or consent. Publius Plautius Rufus was found not guilty of the crime, leaving the identity of the true Publius Rufus an ongoing mystery. And still, pamphlets continued to multiply in the Forum Romanum. Then, in 7 AD, as these political tracts continued to strengthen public support for the descendants of Marcus Agrippa, Julila's brother Posthumus legally emancipated himself from the manus, or ownership, of his grandfather Caesar Augustus. But Julila's brother paid a heavy price for such a bold move. The abdication of Posthumus Agrippa culminated in Caesar Augustus removing his unruly grandson from Rome, banishing him to the Greek colony of Surrentum, and placing him under guard in the early months of 8 AD. But Surrentum, which was located on the Bay of Naples in Campania, stood in close proximity to the Portus Julius, the Misenum naval harbour which had been secretly constructed by their father, Marcus Agrippa, during the civil wars. As the centre of Rome's naval fleet, the Portus Julius, just a few miles across the Bay of Naples from Surrentum, was filled with military men who honoured the name of Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. And on multiple occasions, Julila's exiled brother was permitted by his guards to take a rowboat out into the bay, to go fishing. In 6 AD, soon after Posthumus Agrippa legally emancipated himself from his grandfather's family, retaking his father's name, Julila's husband, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, having been identified as one of the perpetrators of the pamphleting campaign, was executed for maiestas. And Julila's brother, reduced to a disenfranchised son of the late Marcus Agrippa, had been swiftly escorted to the town of Surrentum, on the Bay of Naples, where he was placed under heavy guard. However, talk soon began of electing Posthumus to the 8 AD consulship in absentia, a fact which did not please Julila's grandfather. Nor was her brother behaving. Regular reports were dispatched to her grandfather, Caesar Augustus, from his grandson's Surrentum jailers. Posthumus Agrippa was reported to have violent outbursts. He had committed maiestas, or treason, by publicly raging at the name of his grandfather for holding him prisoner and for stealing his inheritance. Equally treasonous, but more personal, were his accusations against Livia Drusilla, the wife of their grandfather. Pronouncing her the proverbial wicked stepmother, Posthumus Agrippa laid at the feet of Livia all the calamities that had befallen their family. But the most concerning news to Caesar Augustus was the realization that some of the Surrentum guards were discovered to be sympathetic to his grandson's plight. They had frequently allowed Posthumus Agrippa to take a rowboat out into the Bay of Naples, positioned so near Misenum's naval port. Before long, news of a plot reached the ears of Julila's grandfather. 2 men, Lucius Audacius and Asinius Epicodus, were said to be spearheading a full-scale plan to rescue Julila's fallen family. One of the men, Asinius Epicodus, owed his freedman status to Gaius Asinius Gallus, the husband of Vipsania, who was hers and her brother's half-sister. Julila's mother and grandmother were to be rescued from Rhegium, and Posthumus was to be snatched from the town of Surrentum. Once reunited, Scribonia, Julia and Posthumus were then to be rushed to the safety of the legions, likely at the Portus Julius. Although he had excused himself from attendance in the law courts, citing ill health and weakness as his reasons, Julila's grandfather, Caesar Augustus, had somehow managed a rigorous journey north. His new heir, Tiberius Julius Caesar, had been given command over the ongoing conquest of Germania. However, as Julila's stepfather had marched his forces into Gaul, rebellion had broken out in Pannonia. After marching for only a few days, Tiberius had been forced to turn his men around and address the Pannonian revolt. Under the guise of advising Tiberius on the Pannonian campaign, Caesar Augustus met with his newly adopted son and heir in Tiberius's command tent. There, Augustus consulted with Tiberius, now the second man in Rome, regarding the plot to rescue Julia, Scribonia, and Posthumus Agrippa from exile. By the time Julila's grandfather departed from Pannonia, the matter was settled. But not to the benefit of Julila's fallen family. Upon returning to Rome, Caesar Augustus took action. Following the revelation of a plot to liberate Julia and her mother Scribonia from exile, free Posthumus from captivity, and rush them all to the safety of the legions at the naval port of Misenum, Julila's grandfather acted quickly. The masterminds of the plot were tracked down and executed. The exile destination of Posthumus Agrippa, like that of Julila's mother and grandmother, was reassigned. Guards escorted Julila's brother from the town of Sarentum, removing him from the grasp of the populists, and transported Posthumus to Planasia, a small island north of Rome, situated between Corsica and the Italian mainland. The inheritance Caesar Augustus had withheld from his grandson, he donated to the legions stationed at the Portus Julius. Now, with his movements severely restricted, and even more guards to keep him company, there would be no more fishing trips for Julila's little brother. But the battle for the survival of Marcus Agrippa's descendants must go on. It was fated to end forever in the hands of the Claudians. While doing everything possible to shield her identity, Julila chose to pick up and continue to carry the political mantle she had inherited from her mother and grandmother. One way or another, Julila would free her family. Then, the remaining descendants of Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa could exact their vengeance for the deaths of her brothers, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, deaths that could only have been wrought by the Claudian usurpers. When in 4 AD, Tiberius had been ordered by her grandfather to adopt his Claudian nephew, Germanicus, as his primary heir, the dual postings of the office of princeps were reinstated. Only now, it was Tiberius who served as partner to Julila's grandfather, while Livia's grandsons, Germanicus and Drusus, were positioned for grooming and eventual promotion. Quickly working to stitch together the fractured and disparate descendants of the Julian and Claudian families, Julila's grandfather had wed her younger sister, Vipsania Julia, to Livia's grandson, Germanicus. Germanicus's sister, Livilla, was married to Drusus, the biological son of Tiberius. And Livia's final grandson, Germanicus's younger brother, Claudius, was formally betrothed to marry Julila's own daughter, Aemilia Lepida, when both children came of age. But for Julila's son, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, Caesar Augustus gave no mark of preference. Julila's husband had been executed at the hands of her grandfather. Her daughter had been promised to the Claudians, who she blamed for her family's ruinous downfall, and her son, the biological great-grandson of Caesar Augustus, had been cast aside, treated with disregard. This made Julila angry, fueling her unfailing determination to remove the Claudians. Following the execution of her husband, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, near the end of the 7 AD year, Julila, a young widow with 2 children, was now isolated. Of the 5 children born to Marcus Agrippa and Julia Caesaris Filia, only Julila and her younger sister remained. But, in her grandfather's haste to tie together the 2 families, that sister, Vipsania Julia, had been given over to the Claudians, along with Julila's daughter. But, after her husband's execution, Julila and her children were ostracized from the family of Caesar Augustus, Julila's own biological grandfather. Not only was her daughter's betrothal to Claudius quickly cancelled, but Julila's son, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, was omitted in the new line of succession drawn up by her grandfather, which seemed now to centre completely around the descendants of Livia Drusilla, Caesar Augustus's Claudian wife. Julila's late husband, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, had been more than her first cousin and a strategic political match. Paulus had been her protector and her source of power. But now Julila's husband was gone. Without a man, she was powerless to fight the Claudians for the political inheritance that rightfully belonged to her children. And so, Julila turned to a new man. His name was Decimus Junius Silanus. Silanus was the son of Gaius Junius Silanus, a relative of the Marcus Junius Brutus, who, leading the charge against Julila's grandfather, had fought and died for his country at Philippi. Silanus's mother was Appia Claudia, granddaughter of Fulvia, who had also raised an army against Julila's grandfather. Appia was the sister of the Appius Claudius, who had been exiled along with Julila's mother for his role in securing the support of the city plebs to her political cause. Apart from the Claudians, the Junii Silanii were one of Rome's last patrician families left standing, and one of the most powerful. Not only did Julila enter into a relationship with Silanus, but she arranged for the betrothal of her recently spurned daughter, Aemilia Lepida, to one of Silanus's younger cousins, Marcus Junius Silanus Torquatus. Following in the footsteps of her mother, Julila and Silanus took up their places in the centre of the Roman popular zeitgeist, attracting many of the artists, musicians and philosophers that had once gathered around her mother, Julia. Publius Ovidius Naso, known as the poet Ovid, a favourite once patronised by Julila's mother, also flocked with the rest to Julila and Silanus, where he made the unforgivable mistake of witnessing something which should not have taken place. Sometime before the end of the 8 AD year, Julila moved into a new, upgraded palatial villa she had constructed in the country. There, she held a great feast and invited many of her friends and sympathisers. Among the crowd of guests clamouring for a view of Julila's new ostentatious home was her grandfather, Caesar Augustus. After enjoying a feast fit for kings, and visiting with his great-grandchildren Marcus and Aemilia, the party finally came to its end. As the guests filed out of Julila's home, they noticed soldiers posted outside. Then, Caesar Augustus gave the order. Julila was apprehended and taken into custody, and the soldiers immediately set about destroying her wealthy villa. Smashing down every wall, Julila's home was decimated and left in a pile of rubble. Decimus Junius Silanus, a scion of the powerful Junii family, a family Julila's grandfather could not afford to fully offend with accusations of maestas, was charged simply with adultery under the Lex Julia Maritandis Ordinibus. Silanus was told to leave Rome at once. By order of Caesar Augustus, and without senatorial process or the participation of any legal judge, the poet Ovid was also exiled to the town of Tomis on the Black Sea, forbidden ever to reveal the mistake he had witnessed. His official crime lay in a literary work called the Ars Armitoria, a naughty poem celebrating adultery, which Ovid had written and circulated a decade earlier. But in his own words, Ovid wrote that he had been punished for a poem and a mistake. Following her arrest, the demolition of her expensive country villa, and the banishment of Decimus Junius Silanus, Julila was sentenced. Like her grandmother, mother and youngest brother, she was exiled from Rome, transported to an island of her own. Tremorus sat off the coast of the province of Apulia, positioned near the Gargano Peninsula in the Adriatic Sea. The official reasons given for Julila's banishment reflected those given 10 years earlier for her mother's fall from grace. Julila was accused of licentious and wanton behaviour in the face of Rome's strict code of morality, a code imposed on the Roman people by her own grandfather, Caesar Augustus. As with the rest of her exiled family, Julilla was given lodgings in which to live and a modest allowance for maintaining her daily needs, but she was not permitted to leave the island, ever. By the summer of 9 AD, the unborn child tucked discreetly within Julilla's womb when she had been arrested was ready to come into the world. After giving birth to this third child on the island of Tremorus, Julilla learned firsthand the harsh reality of what had once been done to her grandmother, Scribonia Libo. Just as Caesar Divi Filius had taken the infant Julia from Scribonia on the very day she was born, replacing Scribonia's empty hands with a writ of divorce, so too did he, now as Caesar Augustus, order Julilla's newborn snatched from her arms and left abandoned on the side of a mountain. Back in Rome, Caesar Augustus stood before the Senate and decreed that his daughter Julia and grandchildren, Agrippa Posthumus and Julilla, were forbidden to ever return to the city. The father of the nation confirmed these feelings further by adding to his last will and testament orders that, even when they died, Julia, Julilla, and Posthumus were prohibited from being placed within the mausoleum of Augustus, which housed the remains of Augustus's most revered family members. Following the death of Julilla's father in 12 BC, a political battle had raged between the city's populist faction and the Senate's conservative families, each manoeuvring to make certain their choice became successor to the military power of Julilla's grandfather. The populists, who had witnessed a rising meritocracy under Caesar Augustus, supported a continuation through his natural descendants of a government wherein a man could rise by merit, as had Marcus Agrippa. The conservative families who favoured elitism, however, played a more subtle senatorial game, quietly selling their support to the Claudians in anticipation of a revival of Rome's oligarchy under Tiberius. Finally, after 20 years of protests and politics, exiles and executions, the succession of Caesar Augustus was firmly established for the Claudians. But Julilla, separated from her children and left to wither alone on the island of Tremorus, still had one sister remaining who might yet make a difference. Vipsania Julia, otherwise known as Agrippina.